For 2 years now, Motorola's Moto X line has introduced technologies that have subsequently filtered down to the less expensive models. But what happens when Motorola introduces one of those less expensive models as a Moto X? Well, you get the Moto X Play, a really interesting hybrid of low-cost smartphone like the Moto G and more expensive devices like the Moto X Style, which is coming out later this year in the US. Like last year's model, the Moto X Play has a 1080p display, but this one is a little bit bigger at 5.5 inches and uses an LCD panel rather than OLED for much better colors and viewing angles. But the company's clearly saved some money by transitioning from an aluminum frame to a plastic one, though this one is covered in what the company calls a metallic resin to give it a really nice finish, and it does feel metal, surprisingly, when you hold it in the hand. On the softer side, Motorola is still using a light touch, choosing to add only a few apps to stock Android rather than changing the design at all. Motorola thinks that Google's got things pretty well managed when it comes to Android's design and doesn't really want to make any changes, and we commend them for that. Earlier this year, Motorola brought Moto Display to the Moto G, but one thing that's still exclusive to the Moto X line is voice commands, where you can call up Google Now to access a number of features just by saying, "Hey Moto X," or the equivalent phrase that you teach your phone. Now, I'll admit to giving up on Moto Voice soon after I started using the Moto X and the Moto X Play, but for people who tend to talk to their phones, to dictate notes, or to leave reminders, this is a super useful feature, and Google Now just gets better and better, and it doesn't even need a software update to get there. Aside from the classier back cover, which is now removable and textured for better grip, the main change to the Moto X Play from last year's Moto X is the 21 megapixel camera. This is a much better sensor than what we found on the 2014 Moto X, and can still be accessed using that double flip of the wrist to get into the camera app. Indoor shots and outdoor shots alike are hugely improved, and overall clarity, color reproduction, and even dynamic range are just night and day. If this is what the Moto X Play can offer, imagine what the Moto X Style, which has a slightly faster processor with a better ISP. I had a really great time messing with the exposure settings on the Moto X Play, but mostly I just got into the app and took some photos, and comparing them to the Moto X 2014 or even this year's Moto G was night and day. Actually, that's a good place to start talking about comparisons with the Moto X 2014 and Moto G, because is this Moto X really a Moto X in the traditional sense? I mean, it's a $420 phone that looks more like the Moto G than any Moto X before it. But that doesn't really matter. What's most important is that Motorola seems to be able to bring down the price of its flagships to the point where anybody can buy them. You don't have to spend $800, $900 on a great smartphone anymore. Motorola's made that clear in the low end with the Moto E and Moto G, and now it's doing the same with the Moto X. This year's Moto X Play is a huge improvement over last year's in a number of ways, especially battery life. The 3630 milliamp hour battery is enormous and fast charges, so even if it doesn't last 2 days, which it did for me every time I used it, you can put it on the charger for 30 seconds and get back up to 50-75% no problem. I really enjoyed using this phone. It feels good, it's not too big, and it just works, even with that Snapdragon 615 chip that lots of hardcore Android fans are complaining about. If that's your holdup to buying this phone, don't let it be. It's not worth it. If one thing's going to hold it up, it's that you may want to wait for the Moto X Style to come out in a few weeks. But other than that, if you're invested in Motorola, buy this phone.